What's up, BookTube? It's Monty, and today I'm back again, once again, with another video. Today we're going to be discussing The Way of Kings by BookTube's favorite author, one Brandon Sanderson, or as I referred to him in my Goodreads review, Mr. Brandy Sandy. And most people know what The Way of Kings is. And so me, in my infinite goddamn wisdom, decided that I was going to read this 1,000-page tome in like 2 days. I didn't quite hit it, although I will say that I listened to the audiobook, I think according to Libby, in 18 hours. So in less than a full day, over the span of like 3-ish days, I managed to knock out this bitch. And let me just say this, that Brandon Sanderson put me through it. If I remember, I'm going to take some screenshots of a text conversation that I sent to Aaron, but in case I don't put the screenshot on the screen, let me read it to you. And I said, the more that I read of The Way of Kings, the more I understand why Bobby Boy wanted Brandy Sandy to finish his series being The Wheel of Time, because they might as well have been the same person, and I still stand by that decision. The Wheel of Time, specifically The Eye of the Worlds and The Great Hunt, and The Way of Kings read very similarly from a prose standpoint, where characters are like described in very passing detail, where rooms and buildings and like there's general architecture scenes are like kind of described, but again, not so much character descriptions. But we will get back to that because that does play into one of my major criticisms with the book. But like things that don't matter get described, and things that do matter are just like, that exists. You're lucky to get one line in, that's it. Again, this is the first book in a series, but certain things I feel like should have, like, we should call back. The amount of callbacks that Brandon Sanderson incorporated into this 1,000-page story, he could have incorporated some callbacks to room design, to features in the rooms, to like literally anything that he decided, I said it once like 500 pages ago. If they hadn't lived at the same time, him being Bobby Boy and Brandy Sandy, I would probably say that Bobby Boy was reincarnated into Brandon Sanderson, because that's how fucking similar they are. And so if you are like me and you did not fuck with The Wheel of Time, I would be shocked and shaken. Call me a fucking martini if you decided that you vibe with The Way of Kings. So now that I've got that all out of the way, let's get into what The Way of Kings is supposed to be. The only thing that I knew about The Way of Kings going in, well, I knew a couple of things, not just one. So I knew that it was written by Brandon Sanderson. I knew it was the first book in a series. I knew that it was set in the same universe as some of his other books, but you could start here, you could not start here, like do whatever you want. It's the first book. And I knew that it was supposed to be about this war between two sides. After I started reading it a little bit, I discovered that the two sides are the Alethi, which are just like regular humans in the Cosmere on this planet that I'm sure we got a name for, but it's not important enough to me to remember. So on this planet where the Alethi live in the Cosmere, they're at war with the Parshendi. Now, war seems to be very generous a term to be used, and I think that Brandon Sanderson realized this at the end of the book when he had a character call out what they were doing, because essentially they were just like, they were definitely having battles, like there was definitely skirmishes and people were definitely losing their lives, but a war, this was not. Like, I feel like war has a level of communication built in that this just didn't have. Like, they were fighting over these gem hearts, which were concealed inside of these like cavern creatures that lived in the Shattered Plains. But outside of that, there wasn't any kind of discussion. But let's rewind a little. So the book starts off with 2 prologues, the first of which is written like hundreds of millennia in the past I think it's the fall of the Knights of Radiance. So like these banded people who would like come together to be good and just or whatever the fuck in the universe, like they had fallen. And then the second prologue, if I'm remembering correctly, features a Shin assassin who is like doing some assassinating. He is killing one of the kings. And it's this assassination that kind of like leads to the war between the Alethi and the Parshendi, allegedly, because allegedly the Parshendi take credit for this somehow, even though there's no way for the Parshendi and the Alethi to communicate, from my understanding. But the Alethi think the Parshendi take credit for it. And so they're at war on the Shattered Plains, which again, war is very generous a terminology used here because it's just a series of battles for these gem hearts, which is where they get all of like these crystals and things that they use for not only the magic system but also for currency. So like how they actually have a functioning economy in this world, I'm not entirely certain, because they also like, the Alethi at least don't always like grow food. They just kind of like transform other shit into food, and sometimes they transform shit into like weaponry or just like housery, like whatever you need. So like I don't understand if like how the entire economy works here, or if this should actually be like a functioning economy. I would like to see Brandon Sanderson's notes. I'm not an economist, so even if he gave me the notes, I'm not sure they would make sense. But when I was reading it, I was definitely like, this is weird, because then the Alethi also have like this very elaborate slavery system where they have the Parshmen, who are kind of cousins to the Parshendi, but they aren't warriors. So the Parshmen live all throughout the Alethi kingdom doing menial jobs, kind of like slaves, but different because they have slaves. Like slavery definitely exists there, but the Parshmen are kind of like lower than a slave or like higher than a slave. I'm kind of fuzzy on where they fall in the hierarchy, but they're at the bottom of the barrel. Like they're down there, right? And so the Parshmen, like the Parshendi, are both described as being black with marbled red skin, which, okay, interesting. Sometimes the Parshendi are also white with red marbling. Okay. But every time that the Parshendi were on the page, or someone was talking to a Parshman, literally anything to do with either of those two groups, I really thought that Brandon Sanderson was like 2 words away from just hurtling out some racial slurs. And he got awfully close. When he decided to give the fucking Parshendi literal red bones, I was driving to work, but I had never wanted, like, I throw my phone quite frequently when I'm listening to it in here on my bed over here where there's a soft surface. But as I was driving down the street, I almost wanted to hurl my phone out of the car and be like, you know what? I don't need technology. I don't need this. But I couldn't do that. Like, that was, I'm still not over it. Because, and every time I thought that we had, like, reached the tippy top of whatever Brandon Sanderson could do, he would surprise me. We constantly had themes of the Parshendi and the Parshmen both, well, more so the Parshmen. The Parshmen literally cannot speak in full sentences. Literally don't speak in full sentences. They're constantly described as being like happy to be enslaved, happy to be docile, happy that they are being told what to do by the Alethi. And it's something that the Alethi are all white, because there are definitely some characters in the novel that have like speaking roles and like do important things in the narrative that are human characters that are described as like having darker skin or having like, you know, not being pasty wasty. But the problem is that like having melanin, but they're all in the same kingdom and there's no kind of difference. Like the only rock who was like from the mountains, but I don't remember like what his skin color is supposed to be. But like he, and I think the guy who had like one arm, he like lost the other arm, he was supposed to be from somewhere else. But everyone else like grew up in like the regular Alethi melting pot or whatever. And so like having this melanin but having no kind of like cultural backing, like they all have a very homogenous, seemingly white, seemingly at least, I guess, because the Parshendi definitely were described as not being human. Like these are not just like humans who have black skin and red marbling. Like they are completely different species. They are described as having like this weird rocky exterior, which I also thought was, when you have black characters and then you give them like impenetrable skin, like that's like, you're a college educated man. Like, you have a college degree, sir. Like, you didn't think that was questionable? Okay, so you gave them the impenetrable skin because they literally have like this hard exoskeleton thing that is later in the book literally cut from one of their fallen soldiers. When I was reading this, I was actually disgusted. Kaladin decides that he's going to mutilate the dead body of one of the Parshendi. And so we have to read about him actively, he's mutilating this dead body to wear into battle, and then he sees that it upsets them, and then he decides, you know, it would be really great if we mutilated more fallen Parshendi, and we decide to rip the flesh off of them so the rest of my crew can work it. And then he is constantly saying, oh, they eventually, towards the end of the book, there's a parchment that joins Kaladin's crew of people. And not only does this character not have a name, Kaladin takes it upon himself to just name him Parsh. So fucking creative, this idiot. And then he's constantly like, oh, Parsh is one of the guys, Parsh is one of us, Parsh is one of us. He sees that them mutilating the fallen Parshendi upsets him. And he's like, yeah, we're still going to mutilate 20 more guys, so my guys have armor. How people like Kaladin, I don't fucking get. Because even before this point in the narrative, he was upsetting. So let's get into that, shall we? Most of the book is told from Kaladin's perspective. He by far dominates this 1,000-page runtime. And I also think that a large part of this definitely could have been excised from The Way of Kings. We could have had a little novella, because at some point during the narrative, I think that Brandon Sanderson realized that Kaladin's days were all the same. And so we started getting glimpses into Kaladin's childhood that eventually, I think, became a third of the runtime. So like 300 pages is just Kaladin exposition, his backstory. It's not all at once. It's kind of, filtered through parts 2 through 4. You get bits and pieces. We go back to his time, his family, seeing his brother, his mother, his father, where he was living, all of that kind of a thing, how his life trajectory wound him up, getting to this little slave caravan that we found him in at the beginning of the book, which was cute. Like, okay, thank you for this information, but at the same time, I felt like I didn't really need it because I didn't really care. But this man cheated, like, because we saw him from a child to where he was, like, 20 odd years of his life. We saw, like, literally every near-death experience this man had, and every time he's cheating death. And by the 5th time that somebody cheats death out of, like, the 20 times that Kaladin does it, I'm like, I get it. You're not killing this character. Brandon Sanderson is not here to subvert anybody's expectations of anything. And so Kaladin continuing to do that got really repetitive. It got really boring. And I wanted him to die. Especially towards the middle end, when you could really start to see his bigotry, when you could really start to see how much he just, like, the way that the Parshendi were being described, they were all coming from fucking Kaladin, or the random princes that we got for, again, at least 400 pages. I didn't care about the princes on the plains either. We got to see all their bigotry. I was really like, yeah, I need them to die. Like, I need this man to stop cheating death and just get beheaded. So for me, the bright spot of the whole book was Shallan. Listen to the audiobook, you would think would help me pronounce these names, but it's not. So Shallan and Jasnah. Shallan, she was from like some backwater principality situation where her mother was dead, her father died, and her brothers and her had like all of this debt now. They didn't have any means to pay it, and so she was going to go to the city and she was going to try and become Jasnah's ward, and she was going to steal the soul caster that Jasnah had so she would be able to bring it back to her family and they'd be able to use it to acquire some of the wealth back and be able to pay off her father's creditors. So her going to the city to con this woman was by far the most interesting aspect of the story, because both Jasnah and Shallan were both clever individuals, and so they had a lot of just cutting insight into not only each other's characters, but into the larger world that was happening around them. They had a lot of interesting commentary, but also there was a lot of shit that was happening in the city that was just interesting. Like, their days were never the same, where Kaladin, we would get to see, like, some of these I listened to the audiobook. So some of these chapters are literally an hour long, 45 minutes long. Like, the very few of them were under like 20 minutes. And so we would get a very expansive look into Kaladin's week in some of his chapters. And it's like every day he's waking up, he's lifting this piece of goddamn wood, he's trying to rally the bridgemen, trying to like make them into soldiers, and like that slow progression of him like winning them over, like it got really monotonous. And so getting to be with Shallan and seeing her study and trying to convince people and like doing things like act like she was actively in a position to be able to do things and actually doing them was just far more interesting than whatever the fuck was going on over there with Kaladin. And so for parts 2 and 3, well, really all of part 2, Shallan really doesn't appear. And then parts 3 and 4, like 3, 4, 5 for Shallan are like very close together in time. But again, like it was a welcome relief to see Sis back in the story. Even when she was doing shit that didn't make sense, even when she was doing shit where you're like, this is not going to work out for you, like this is very clearly going to blow up in your face, it was more interesting. Because when it came to Kaladin, he was doing things that we also knew were going to blow up in his face, but we would see him do that like 10 times. Like every time he was doing something, we knew it was going to blow up in his face, and then it got to a point where Kaladin knew it was going to blow up in his face, but he was still doing this shit. And so like what people like about this man, I honestly don't know, because to me he was boring, he was monotonous, and then when he wasn't those things, he had literally nothing to offer me that he hadn't already given me. So I hated it here, from the way that the Parshman and the Parshindi were treated, from the way that Kaladin just dominated the story. And I mean, I didn't hate, what was his name? Dallin? I don't think that was the Cullen brother that was like having the visions. He was interesting. He was interesting at times. Like he was, but I also want to say that in the text, the book is called The Way of Kings, but in The Way of Kings, the Knights Radiant, the Radiant Knights, whatever the fuck they were called from ye olde days on the Cosmere Plains, they had a text that they lived by also called The Way of Kings, and it was giving very Bible to me. A lot of the things were giving very Bible. Like the Alethi they were very religious people. They pray to the Almighty. They have all kinds of custom and things that are related to their religion. I didn't think that the religion aspects were all that fleshed out to me, but that I do think that a large part of that had to do with that the Ardents, who are like kind of priest-like in essence, were mostly in the Shallan chapters, and we didn't get very many Shallan chapters. So between that and working out the religions, it's like it just wasn't going to work. So I hate that for the culture, hated that for me. But between the Almighty, there was like the religion just came in at the end of the last 20 or so pages of this book featured religion in such a way where I was like, this is not what I was expecting. The Way of Kings, the in-universe text, The Way of Kings, very much is giving Bible. Like, it was very biblical. And I almost wish that it had been written slightly differently, so like it wouldn't just come across as just straight Bible. Like, it could give me like a different vibe. But that was also something that I constantly side-eyed. As for whether I would want to continue, I still don't know. Like, I don't think that this is Brandon Sanderson's Eye of the World, because I gave it 2 stars, so it's more like his Great Hunt. But even when I finished the Great Hunt, I had to sit down and think to myself, like, is this series going to give me what I want it to give? And when I think about the Stormlight Archive, one, the last 2% of the book, specifically the last Shallan chapter, like the last chapter for each of our perspectives, definitely it was purely for setup, because the way that this book is structured, like, sure, you could want to go on, but I don't know if you would want to go on into another 1,000-page monstrosity. That's where I think the fuck up is. So yes, I think that for the longest time reading this, I was like, I don't know how you're gonna have, I think this is also supposed to be another 10-book series, and I'm like, I don't know how you get to like 10,000 pages 25,000 pages in this story. Like, I don't think the story needs 25,000 pages. And even how it ends, you're kind of like, okay, you're clearly gonna have to like wrap that up though. Like, there's no way you can just continue on and like not wrap something up, because in so many ways the Way of Kings not only has two prologues, but the entire story reads like a prologue. So I can see now like where you could continue on the story, but I don't see where the scope of this saga lies, which is fine. I don't have to see the scope of your saga. Like, you can just tell me that the scope is going to be there. But after reading this, I'm going to have definite trust issues. So I'm not going to rule it out, because at this point I've learned on my channel to just never rule something out, but it's certainly not a priority, because I'm still upset about the Parshendi and the Parchment. I thought all of that was disgusting. I'm still not in love with Kaladin, and the idea of having to like jump back into his mind doesn't sound very pleasant to me. And as much as I love Shallan and Jasna, it's kind of like, when I ask like, does improvement matter? It's like, do two characters matter? Like, are two characters that could like, they could potentially die. Like, is it good enough to just continue to read for them? And I don't know. So I think that's where I'm going to end this rambly, ranty discussion. If you've read The Way of Kings, let me know down below in the comment section. If you haven't and have no plans to, that's also great. If you don't have anything, nothing to contribute, you can always leave this emoji down there, and I'll see you guys again soon with another video. But until then, and until next time,